welcome to Zeitgeist, the show where we talk about all the latest TV and movies while we listen to the latest music. As we are nearing the summer movie season, I do think we're probably officially there by the time you're hearing this. We're going to be talking about what is maybe the most prescient thing near the end of May, which is a little behind the scenes here in Hollywood. This is the final moments of what you call the Emmy window. Now, the Emmys actually premiere in September, but near the end of May, that's when all the really buzzy, prestige-y shows have all come out, sometimes in a huge deluge. And it's our job here at Zeitgeist to sort through that deluge and figure out what is the most important stuff. So today we're going to be talking about two shows on HBO Max. Am I naming it correctly? It's HBO Max now, right, Niv?
Yeah, HBO Max.
And we're going to be talking about two shows, Industry and The Pitt, later on. Joining me, as I believe I've already mentioned, is my co-host, Mr. Neve L. Boz. How you feeling? How are you feeling about today's...
Blah 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 blah. Well, that's my impression of the people out in Netflix who are disappointed for not owning HBO, because really, even though it's called HBO Max now, it will be eventually called Paramount Max very soon. So. Yeah.
Oh, you think that's going to be it? Paramount Max? People are calling it in the industry, they're calling it Warner Mount. That'll come up more in our second half, the ins and outs of the film and TV industry. In the first half, we're going to be talking about a different kind of industry, an industry that has been around for a number of centuries. And interestingly enough, we're not going to be talking about American capitalism. We're talking about UK capitalism and the show Industry. Now, that show is a co-production between HBO and some British distribution company. But this is a show that I've had on my radar since, I think, season 2. And Niv, you started watching it around season 3, right?
No, season 2 too.
And you've kept up with it pretty steadily over the years? I mean, I know I love the show, but you have a little bit more of a complicated relationship with it, right?
I remember I started seeing a ton of advertisement for it on HBO, but only starting from the second season when it really started exploding. It only really truly exploded on season 3 because they got big actors for it. But I remember seeing it everywhere, and then I looked it up and I was like, oh, okay, this show has really good reviews, so I should just check it out, right? I mean, that's how we sort of watched Chloe. It was a show that got really good reviews, and also Adolescence, a show that got really good reviews. So I gave it a try and I enjoyed it, but as you said, my complicated relationship with it had to do with sort of the characterization of the main character because it only took literally 4 whole seasons for her to become a character, in my opinion.
That's very interesting. So about that main character, Industry is a show, as I mentioned, focusing on the finance world in the UK. It revolves around a diverse cast of companies and spectators surrounding the hedge fund Pierpoint and its disgraced protege, Harper Stern. Harper is played by the actress Myha'la, and she is a actress that premiered in Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. That was the first time I saw her. She's been in a number of other smaller film productions over the years. She also often will play a character who can be a little bit more steely, none more so than Harper, who is, as you mentioned, the lead of the show, the central main character. She is notably a ruthless scammer, often a disruptor, certainly. She's driven by pure ambition, and she believes in success at all costs. And alongside her is the deuteragonist, who I think by season 4 plays pretty much as a co-lead in many ways, who is Yasmin, played by Marissa Abella. Once again, an actress who has made a number of films on her own. She has, I would say, one major hit and one major flop, in my opinion. The major hit that I would rather discuss was the Steven Soderbergh spy thriller Black Bag from last year, which was, I think, really lovely. Yasmin is kind of opposite to Harper in some ways. She has more of an attenuation towards humanity. She is much more interested in physical connection, to be polite. And she is also someone who came from money, right? Harper came from nothing. Yasmin came from everything. But Yasmin, she hungers for human connection, whereas Harper is kind of a cold-blooded killer.
What's really wonderful about their relationship is the fact that they sort of ebb and flow with each other. They get close to each other and fight each other. Really, Myhala's like character, like Harper, is a true protagonist of the show, but she is so self-destructive and really destructive of everyone around her that no one is safe, including, of course, the people closest to her or the people she like briefly allows in. And Yasmin is sort of the same. Like, what's really interesting about Yasmin's character is that in the beginning, she is very sweet, but there is like a darkness in her. She's not necessarily a cold-blooded killer yet, but she wants to be. You can see her hungering for it and sort of capitalizing on the things that she can. And in a lot of ways, the world that they're in, the very cutthroat world of investment banking, created these monsters, so to speak, in these characters, because they truly do become monsters. But what's interesting is the show didn't necessarily start with just them. The cast was very well rounded. But by the time of season 4, it really is just them. And what's really interesting is that season 4 in particular, which we're going to talk about mainly, sets them up into, like, you call them co-leads. I actually think it's more appropriate to say a protagonist-antagonist sort of relationship with each other.
Absolutely. In many ways, Harper is the antagonist to Yasmin and vice versa. Now, obviously, the way that the show has been arranged, we are, I think, more apt to root for Harper. But as I think you've already hinted to, it's a weird connection because Yasmin is a much more human, squishy person, and Harper is much more analytical, specific. She often will push people away. Blunt, definitely. But you do see them intersect, right? And cross over. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about this season as a whole, not to get too spoiler heavy, which is that this season is, I think, one of the best in the show's history because it manages to pivot these characters so that Yasmin becomes more psychotic, to be blunt, and Harper becomes much more human and squishy. You mentioned also that this show has a rotating cast, which is definitely something that is worth noting and something I wanted to bring up. The idea of the disposable character is, I think, something that's become more and more prevalent on these ensemble cast shows, and we're going to see a lot more of this year. In fact, we're going to see a lot more of this episode when we start talking about the Pitt as well. But also, it's worth noting that a show that we covered 2 or 3 years ago, Ted Lasso, which we thought was going to be the last season, is now coming back, but the entire cast of boys has been turned around, and he's following an entirely new cast of footballers, and I believe that it's a women's cast now.
Yeah, it's a women's team. And you have other people like Cal Penn, Jack Farthing, who's been, covered by us many, many times. And even before that, in season 4, Sarah Goldberg, and of course the biggest draw that carried over from season 3 to season 4, Kit Harington, who was arguably the real reason why the show exploded because he was like the biggest actor that they could get.
And his character, Henry Muck, continues to gain more and more prevalence as the show goes on. He has a smaller part in season 3, but obviously, and I guess mild spoilers for season 3. I don't want to spoil too much on season 4, but I think it is important to say that at the end of season 3, Muck and Yasmin become a couple. And now in season 4, the main tension is, I think, even beyond the tension around Tender, is the tension between Yasmin and her husband, Henry, who is old money. He's even, I think, more rich than Yasmin. He's a recovering drunk, and he is a charismatic leader often. He's someone that I think a lot of people do look up to because of that charisma, but he is just tragically insecure. Do you feel like that's a good read? Also, as someone who is a Game of Thrones fan, how do you feel like he ranges in that charisma relative to, obviously, his famous character, Jon Snow?
First of all, I think all of the characters, literally almost all of them, are intensely and tragically insecure. That's like the whole point of industry. The talk about like how high the ceiling is definitely pushed and engined by your own insecurity because you cannot stay still. And in fact, I wanted to talk about this. The reason why this cast becomes rotating is not necessarily because, like characters get killed off or, they just get thrown off to the wayside. Industry does something really intelligent where when the characters actually find themselves and are comfortable with themselves, that is when they leave. Like when they're actually happy. Whereas the characters that still pursue that ambition and still hunger for it to the point of very much self-destruction, those are the characters that have remained in the toxic world that is industry. Now, to your other question, how does it compare to Jon Snow? Look, it's like apples and oranges. Kit Harington is a good actor. He was a baby when he started doing Game of Thrones. I'm really glad that he gets a platform such as this to show his acting chops because he is a really good actor and he absolutely is a star. But I'm also just glad that he doesn't play Mr. Goody Two Shoes. I think it's nice to see him have like this kind of range and have like a role he gets to experiment a lot in because in season 3 and in season 4 they give him a lot to do.
I never watched Game of Thrones. Would you say that he's the moral center of that program?
I mean, like there's a ton because it's like a huge cast, right? But he eventually becomes sort of the main character of that story. Spoilers, I guess. But yeah, like there are sort of focuses, right? As we've talked about, because it is such a huge cast and there are moral centers everywhere and sort of heroic characters versus the more villainous characters that we get to latch onto. But Jon Snow, he becomes the narrative engine of that story because in a lot of ways he's like the last one standing. The focus of that story has to be with him because he's the one pushing the more heroic storyline that remains in that story.
Well, then it's interesting to see that in connection to something like industry, which is obviously less heroic in its pursuits, but it is also equally interested in the grime and the underworld. It's just that the upstairs in our modern context feels very different from the upstairs downstairs dynamic of, say, a period piece. But you were talking about the characters and how a lot of people have come and go. It is also worthwhile to note that some of those characters that were maybe margin characters in seasons 2 and 3, like Sweet Pea Golightly, played by Miriam Peach, she has a fairly major plot dynamic, which comes out of left field near to the middle of the season. And characters who we consider to be mainstays during the time when Pierpoint was the focus. And I guess we should also talk about the broader context of the program as Pierpoint. But Rishi, the character of Rishi, was one of the staple characters at Pierpoint alongside Ken Lung's character Eric Tao. These were two people who were established at the hedge fund that in the first season are recent grads, Harper and Yasmin, and also Gus and Robert Sterling, played by Harry Lottie, who was sort of the moral center of the show until his departure at the end of season 3. These characters were all, I think, sort of together, and they were all considered more or less equal to Yasmin. Harper was obviously always the main lead.
Yasmin was also lesser because she was like relegated to almost like what was it, buying coffee, whereas Harper and like Robert, like Lottie's character, they had things to do, and David Johnson was in like a different department with his character Gus. But it is interesting because they were fresh grads from university, and even then, the way they speak to them is trainees at Pierpoint, because I remember I rewatched the first episode not that long ago, and it was interesting seeing them being interviewed and them asking, like Ken Lung asking them, okay, what do you want to do? Why are you here? Like, how can you be of use to me? And their lack, because when you're in an interview, it is interesting. You will say whatever you can to get the job. But the thing Ken Lung does really well is that he sees these people and he's like, are you hungry for it? Are you actually genuinely hungry for it? Because he is that first line of defense to tell us, the audience, like, This is not a safe space.
But at the same time, Eric does have some level of moral value and moral center. He is the standard that Pierpoint operates on in the early seasons. And Harper, as a character, is based solely in undermining those values. And the reason why the show eventually shifts away from Pierpoint, I think, is largely due to the fact that eventually Harper's lack of moral compass outgrows the institution of Pierpoint as a whole.
She also helps destroy it, right? Because she, like, spoilers, she leaves Pierpoint and she is so bitter about it that she is very much like, okay, I'm not good enough for you. Let's prove you wrong. Like, that becomes a major plot point in season 3. But I think what I'm trying to say is that what's really interesting about season 1 is how green all the characters were. Especially when you look at that first episode, those characters are kind of, it can be compared to, you know, one of those young adult dramas of just like these young people.
Like a Euphoria type.
Not even that, like maybe even like something like Skins.
I totally would compare it to Skins.
Like these young people living in London, you know, doing young people things, working in like a highly stressful environment. It just feels like a young show, especially in that first season, because the characters are still figuring out that world. But in season 2, when they're actually ingrained in that world, it becomes less like what I just described, and it becomes more like Mad Men, of how cutthroat they are to each other and how very much they're fighting not only to survive but to succeed, and at what cost, right? Because as you said, like, Harper Stern is a tornado of a character who constantly undermines everything around her to come out on top. But again, at what cost? Because eventually, the cost is literally her own position at the company she's worked so hard for.
Yeah, that's true. But at the same time, you then get an opportunity, right? Every time there's a big drop in the show. And I do think that, especially starting with season 3 and moving into season 4, this show does pack a lot of ideas into not a lot of time. And it does so in a way that is both manageable and also pretty aggressive. And it does open up the question of, when does a show stop being a show? And that, I think, will stretch credulity in our next episode when we talk about Euphoria. But in this show, I think we see this done, I think, well.
Yes, I agree.
Where the beginning of the show is more or less Skins. It's more or less a show about some young co-ed grads who are working together and maybe backstabbing sometimes, but in general, they're all part of a cohort. And as time moves on, the cohort does dissipate, and you're left with the dregs of that cohort and what does that imbue to the show. And I think what does hold it together is, A, we still keep our same main character. Harper continues to move through season by season by season, and she's not as prevalent in like season 3, I would say. I would say that that show more heavily features a broader cast range. And I also think Harper doesn't go through a major character arc in season 3 the way she does in season 4.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that opens up the show to a more wide-ranging and often different kind of tone. In season 4, one episode is almost even, I mean, how would you describe it? It is like a ghost story. Like, there's a lot of stuff in this new season that would not have felt at home in season 1. And yet it does still feel broadly like the same show.
Industry.
Right. And so my question is, how far can we extend that? Could the show do a full cast reset and continue to move on?
No, not now, because like it's set up like an insane conflict for next season. But I think what you touched on was really important. This show is one of the few shows out there, and I really say this with a lot of like, you know, respect. It's one of the few shows that actually reinvents itself every season, and it works. I mean, season 3 is the one that, like, in terms of like how much it reinvented itself, it could be argued it became more mainstream rather than reinvented itself. But even then, it was still going leaps and bounds than other shows out there with how much, you know, it tried to do. Because there were episodes in season 3, I think even the ghost story thing you were referring to in season 4, there were things like in season 3 that were quite similar. Like, again, like a whole episode about Rishi.
Yep, the Rishi episode, which was not my favorite, but I do think it paid off well in season 4. They
Yeah,
held it close to that character arc and brought Rishi back out, and then also did some other things.
yeah, Rishi as a character, like just for our audience sake, he is a character that is very reprehensible. Like starting from season 1, he's someone you see and he's like this one-dimensional character who's just a you can bleep me for this, an asshole. And he continues to be that, but then like in season 3, because these auxiliary characters become more defined and explored, we start to understand who he is as a person because there is more focus on him. We're going to talk about this with the Pitt, but there are characters that were sort of not really important in season 1 that became a lot more important in season 2, or a lot more focused on and explored. And that's what I mean. Shows with big casts, and this could be argued also for Game of Thrones. When you have a big cast and becomes a rotating cast, etc., what really smart shows do is they look at the auxiliary characters that already exist, like the smaller characters that were really just supporting characters, and then the focus becomes on them because they are also growing in this world. They're also changing. They're also doing things, and they're becoming more of a focus as well because this is a world that's very much alive. And again, in the world of industry, people come in and out, people become stronger, they become weaker, roles get like switched and reversed. And that's the wonderful thing. Characters are really dynamic in this world. And that's what makes industry arguably a really good watch, because you never know what's going to happen with any of these characters. Even the strangest things, like watching a ghost story, makes sense because, again, it's all rooted in the fact that these characters are really unpredictable, but still understandable in their behavior.
As we are rounding the corner into talking about our next section, which is the Pit, I also want to discuss maybe also the things that the characters do that are a little bit more reprehensible. And I think that also speaks larger to the concepts that the show deals with, right? We've been largely talking about the characters and the ensemble, which is obviously the things that draw us into this show more broadly, but there's also the mechanics of this. And you see this a lot in shows like Succession too. People will often compare Industry and Succession because they are so heavy on things like jargon. The thing that really drives this season is that there is a company called Tender, which Harper thinks is overvalued as a company. And so she does something called a short sell, which is essentially buying a bunch of stocks on loan and then holding on to them, hoping that they're going to fall in price, and then selling those stocks out and making a profit.
In layman's terms, she's betting on the fact that the company will fail. That is what she's known for. Harper, and it's very much in tune with the character that's been made here, she bets on things failing. And she does everything in her power to make sure it fails. Because when it does, she gets a huge amount of money for it. And that's the really reprehensible part. Because how can you want like these really big companies to fail when that means like a bunch of people are going to lose their livelihoods, their jobs?
But also, Harper is not someone who is interested in the individual. What she is interested in is herself, predominantly, but also she wants vindication. And I do think that she largely views other people as objects within her sphere of influence to either be used and discarded or to be operators within her world. So someone like Eric, he's someone that follows her value. And so broadly, Harper is interested in keeping Eric around for that reason. So that's why she often will bring people back into the fold that she once was working with. So she'll bring in these reprehensible people. Like Rishi didn't need to come back to the show, but Harper was like, come back in, buddy. And of course, that caused some drama. Certain people who were also former Pierpoint employees who were part of this new company that Harper Stern was creating called Stern Tao with Eric, that company was not broadly beloved by the financial industry as a whole. But she was able to leverage previous connections at Pierpoint to be able to staff her team with people who are relatively competent. But that being said, she's also staffing some pretty horrendous people. I mean, there's also Kenny, who makes an appearance later into the season. He was a smaller character in later seasons. He's not particularly nice. I imagine that she'll probably bring in other people who were more prominent that also weren't necessarily very nice. I can't imagine we're going to go through the rest of the series without incorporating Jesse Bloom, who was such a huge part of season 2. But that being said, all of these characters are obviously wallpaper to the larger narrative, and Harper's plight or success is obviously due to these successes or failures, these major swings and these huge bets that she's taking. Because that's the other thing, is not only is she betting on other people to fail, is she betting on thousands of people losing their jobs, but she's also doing so at great expense and at great risk to the hedge fund that she's running. And so she's also kind of
I
gambling.
mean, not even kind of. She is. She is literally betting and betting money from her, money from other people for these things to fail. And that's the irony here, because she and the people around her can also fail at a moment's notice. That's how
Oh,
intense it is.
instantly. But that's the thing with the stock market is it's changing every day. And like Rishi is in season 3 like just a real life gambler. He's just going to casinos. So we get a broader context from the show as a whole indicating that these people are gambling addicts, that they just have a culture and a job that allows them to hold on to this, but not to say that that vindicate them. And especially characters like Whitney, who I think is the true face of evil on the show. He's the ultimate liar. He's the ultimate cheater. I think to me, he's kind of the clear villain on the show as a whole, because as the show goes on, we see more and more reason to believe. And I mean, even near the beginning, because he fires Cal Penn in the first couple minutes of the show, we are very clear early on that Whitney is a single purpose operator, and his operator is to make himself a whole ton of money, just like Harper. But what he is willing to do that is so much more thought out. Whereas Harper is kind of running by the seat of her pants, spur of the moment. She's working on instinct. Whitney is planning. He has plans on top of plans. That's how evil I think Whitney is. And so I would argue him as the villain
Well,
because
I
of it.
think it's interesting because I think in every season there was like a quote unquote villain, right? Maybe not so much in season 1 because I feel like it was just the management. They were the villains, like the Pier Point management. But then you would get singular villains or something akin to that in each season working, with respective main characters. And, it just builds and builds and builds. And that's what I mean, tying it back to this idea that, these characters, the characters that have remained, the two main characters, Marissa Abella and Mayhala, playing, of course, Yasmin and Harper, they've remained because they've fought for their survival. They are still not truly happy with themselves. But what's really interesting is that both characters during this particular season almost find their respective happiness. And what sort of ruins it is literally themselves and their relationship to each other. And what I mean by that is that even though Whitney was sort of the main villain of season 4, this season did a really smart choice of pinning or at least sizing them up to be against each other because they were, on two ends of the fight. One was fighting for the company to succeed, the other one was fighting for the company to fail. And essentially, I talked about my sort of annoyance with this show because I feel like this show has really succeeded in almost everything except Harper's character, which is frustrating because she's the lead. But what I mean by that is that Harper was so self-destructive throughout the whole run of the show that it made her so unlikable, and it's very difficult to follow and empathize with a character that is unlikable. And the fact that character is the focus of the show could be torture sometimes. And I don't mean that in a lack of a better word. That is the word. And at the end of the day, what made Harper work for me this season, not necessarily that she became likable, it's just her actions finally came up with consequences, like real consequences that affected her and made her reflect. I think this is the first season in a really long time, and not even, I think, from the very beginning of the show, that Harper Stern actually reflected on her own actions and came to terms with it in really interesting and vulnerable and human ways. On the opposite of that, Yasmin, being one of the most vulnerable characters in season 1, has become very much like Harper Stern in season 1. Someone hungry, someone destructive, someone cutthroat. So, in a lot of ways, they've just reversed places and they're still getting used to these new roles. And that's why they're very close to quote unquote finding their happiness. They haven't found it yet because now they're on truly opposing sides to each other. And it's going to be really interesting seeing season 5, which is going to be the final season as we know, and seeing their conflict finally play out as it's been building for the last 4 seasons.
To speak broadly about the thematic elements that tie all of this show together, and to also respond to the fact that you obviously had a distaste for Harper, I obviously, first of all, I don't agree that Harper is an unlikable character. I think that that's just my opinion. And I think that it largely stems from the fact that Harper is broadly a liar and a cheater foremost, that those are her two main conceits. And in order to buy into that, you also have to buy into her underdog story. Now, whether that underdog story is all truth is obviously going to be negligible because you can't trust her as a character at all. And so you have to rely on the fact that we do meet her brother, for example, in the early seasons, that we see little clips of her and her outside life without actually really ever confronting what that outside life looks like, whether she really would belong if she left the world of high finance and moved somewhere else, if this really is her last chance at doing something that she feels is meaningful. And I think that is largely what makes me root for Harper, even throughout all of her foibles, even throughout all of the ways in which she is insider trading, which she does frequently, all throughout the times in which she is mean or vindictive or downright cutthroat and just throwing other people under the bus, is a belief in her as sort of a figure and a figure of capitalism and a figure that maybe even represents someone like Donald Trump, but somebody who is willing to do whatever it takes in order to achieve a kind of greatness. And that level of ambition is something that is obviously, as I've just mentioned outright, very applicable in America by and large, but also applicable in the United Kingdom, in which politics does have that sense still in its DNA. And I think that that's what makes something like Industry so vital to our current time, but also something that I think has potential to be more timeless. And that is, I think, also true of The Pitt. Whether I view these two shows on equal footing, we'll talk about in the second half, but it is worth noting that the way in which the financial industry is being satired and condemned in Industry is so committed by its creators, and similarly the way that The Pitt is being committed to in the second season of this now award-winning show is also being committed to in a very, very, very different sense. And all that being said, I think we're ready to move on to some music. And after that, I think it's time for us to talk in a more spoiler-heavy conversation in the second half on The Pitt, on, once again, HBO Max. So, spoilers ahead, just forewarning. Feel free to listen to some music and stay tuned. Hi there, listener. I know you are not hearing music right now. That's because we actually do a legal form of music streaming that you can find exclusively on our homepage, which is Mixcloud. So if you are interested in listening to a playlist that I personally curate for every single episode, then I would highly recommend you take a trip to Mixcloud and finish the episode starting exactly here where you left off and listen to that playlist and then dive into the second half. That said, if you choose not to do so, here's the second half right now. And we're back. Okay, as I mentioned, we're diving headfirst into season 2 of The Pitt. Spoilers ahead. This show is obviously a darling to much of America. This is one of the most popular shows ever on HBO Max. It's a day in the life each season of an emergency department and the return of Noah Wiley from ER, mixing the reliable style of a medical drama, like something like maybe a Grey's Anatomy, with the raw tension of a show like 24. The Pitt won Best Drama at the Emmys last year and signified a return to form in the aftermath of prestige TV. This show is unique in the way that it intertwines characters, much like Industry, but with a lot more optimism and with a style that is reminiscent of the TV shows of yore. So, Niv, let's talk about the way in which you related to the Pit. It's kind of funny now. You were talking about how the watching of Industry felt like torture to you. We've talked on the show before
Not in
about your fear
general,
of blood.
just the Harper scenes. Let's not get carried away.
Okay, so the main character of the show felt like torture to you.
Yes.
How in the world did you get through watching The Pit? This is a show that I, honest to God, knew that we were going to have to cover on the podcast, but you were the impetus of actually covering it at all. And it was because you were able to knuckle through this show. We mentioned on the podcast before that you have a fear of blood. How did you like the HBO Max show, The Pit?
I plead the fifth. No, I can't do that. No, here's
All
the
right,
thing.
that's a great episode. Talk to
Yeah,
us later.
and I am Nivel Boss.
So Niv, let's get you in the therapy chair.
Oh my god, no, no,
So
no,
where
no,
did your fear
no.
of blood come from?
Oh my god. All right, just how I bare knuckled. Again, it has to do with the fact that usually what we do, you and I, is that we look at Metacritic, we see what's really high up there in terms of numbers, and usually when a show gets over like 80% on Metacritic, that's insane. That's really rare. So I think when we both saw that, we were just kind of like, wow, this show is apparently really good and it's on HBO Max. But for me, it went a step farther where I was like, okay, it's a medical drama. I don't like medical dramas for the obvious reason that it often involves blood versus more, actiony, stylized blood you see in other shows. But I wanted to give it a try, and by the time like I heard about the show, it had already finished like its first season run. Like I think like the week before I started watching it. So I did something crazy. I binged it. And I felt like that was the most authentic experience you could have watching it. Because obviously, as you said, it's similar to the show 24, which is a show that very much focused on an hour of one day. So each episode represented 1 hour. And it's the same in The Pit. Each episode represents 1 hour in that one day. And it was sort of insane watching, all of it together. But it made it feel like more realistic because you were living it through the characters. Because they were also living that specific day on each hour. So I just felt like I was in that ER with them. Or not so much as like a doctor, but as like this helpless hostage stuck with them watching this all unfold.
You
And
were a patient in the ER, just they're having their way with
more
you.
like that's the thing. I was like a patient, but my diagnosis was panic attack. that kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger based on like the episodes I watched.
Wow, that's so funny that you say that
Yeah,
coming
but
on to season 2 here. Because you're not the only one,
yeah, but
huh?
that's the thing. I actually found season 2 a lot more manageable because I watched it week by week. And I actually enjoyed it much more, even though it was very stressful. I enjoyed it much more watching it all together in that first season than I did in season 2. I actually thought it lost a lot of its power and its magic by just watching it week to week because I was just kind of like, okay, this is like any other medical drama because I had already disengaged. Like I'd watch it, I'd be in it, I'd be like, wow, this is really good. But then every time it was about like something was going to happen. In fact, it really pissed me off that every episode in season 2, when it ended, it felt like it was just a scene. There was no real climax. It was just kind of like, oh, something kind of is happening, but we're not going to show it. And then the characters would look up and be like, oh no. But then nothing would happen. And I'd be like, okay, guess I have to tune next week to see what maybe happens. Whereas in the first season, I'd just be like, oh no, something happened. And then 2 seconds later, I'd see what would happen and be like, oh no, I'm stressed again.
So obviously, the main structure of the show is 1 hour, 1 hour, 1 hour, and the names of the episodes are pretty boring because it's just the hour, right? And you are led to believe that that hour is lined up with reality and the sun sets at about the right time and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This particular episode has a very late sunset because we're in the midst of the equinox, the summer equinox. So it's the one of the longest days of the year, July 4th. And yes, this season does keep up the cliffhanger endings, but they are still reliably dramatic and justified, but also the way in which this show is aligned in season 2 is much more low key and character based, in my opinion, than in the previous season. So in season 1, the pacing I think was incredibly strong. Now, I do want to note that you mentioned Metacritic. The Metacritic score did dramatically rise in season 2. However, I do think that that is due to the fact that the critics who tuned in again for season 2 were focused on the characters and they got much more character based plot. The way that this season turns inwards towards Dr. Robby, who is the main character of the show, the lead played by Noah Wiley. He is the one who carries the ED on his back. He is suffering from pretty bad PTSD in the first season, and we get way more of that in season 2. And he is also the attending doctor on staff. So everybody is asking him questions. He's the point person. Everybody is relying on Robby to be more or less the spine of the body of the emergency department. So in season 1, you have this really, really strong climactic moment. In the second half of the season, there is a concert called Pitt Fest. Once again, if you haven't watched the show, this is spoilers. There is a shooting at the concert, and there is a lot of people impacted. There are a lot of people who presumably have died, a couple people, and there have been many others who have been injured and come to the emergency department. And we even get a sense on who the Pit Fest shooter might be throughout the season. So all of these things keep the tension pretty much at a rock solid high point throughout most of the middle section. And the tops and bottoms of the show start to decline that tension a little bit, but you still get, by and large, the middle section with a high, high, high tension point. And there's a lot of blood. In the second season, you obviously do get some pretty gnarly stuff because it's July 4th. There are people's fingers getting blown off. I would say that largely is a thing that's like isolated and not a big part of the conflict of the show at large. The big conflict in the middle of the show is there's somehow a court hearing going on upstairs, despite the fact that this is a federal holiday, which maybe we can just chalk that up to the wonders of imagination. The other thing is that there is a outage, and the outage comes from a hacker who is hacking the system, not just the one hospital, but the entire system. So that makes it a show that has tension, but I think the cyber attack on the hospital's network, which leaves the hospital without power for several hours, what it really is doing is it's just extending the day for the overworked staff. So what that gets in response is that these people are just more at edge and they're more willing to fight with each other. And that's really an internal conflict within the world of the doctors. And it's less about the patients in season 2. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think what was interesting is that, once they came up with like a system, right? In that first season, they focused on, just developing the characters, showing us this world, showing us like how insane the ER gets, because I don't think people fully understand sometimes how insane that environment is. If you go there and as a patient, especially, you're just very much like focused on yourself, like and your issues. But these nurses and doctors have to deal with these issues day in and day out. And eventually that becomes so psychologically like draining that it's like a wonder that you can even stand, let alone get into work every day. And the show did a really good job of just like sticking to that ethos and going through it in a very, very specific manner of getting from point A to point B. Because you also get introduced to the characters who are much like an industry. You get like the characters who have just started becoming like doctors and are still in medical school, and the characters that are like management, the actual doctors, and of course the actual administrators above the doctors. And like I said, in industry, it was very much that we got introduced to characters who are like hungry, and who are like part of this cohort, this young cohort, and of course the management above them. But in season two, these characters, much like an industry, these younger characters become much more comfortable in their roles. They're mentoring younger characters that have just come in as well, who are also in medical school and don't know the ER environment as well as they do. Because the difference of season one and season two is just 1 year, and sort of seeing how everybody's changed in that 1 year on that one day as well. What's really interesting, at least was season two, is that push making the characters more comfortable in that world, but also throwing even crazier things at them, because there was like a bunch of things, as you pointed out. There was like the cyber attack on the hospital that made them go all analog, the fact that it was the 4th of July, and of course, like a bunch of like character drama that was carried over from season one into season two that was affecting everyone, not just individual characters, but really everyone. And what it made it feel like a proper like movie sequel that, on the first one you go more personalized and more focused, but then that second one you go bigger and bolder and you throw more shit on the wall. But what I found it to be was a much lesser enjoyable experience because it was less focused. But when it did get focused on one particular thing, which was Noah Wiley's character, the Robby storyline, that's where I was like, okay, this is still the emotional core, and the emotional core very much works. Because, this is not so much a spoiler because it's introduced almost immediately. The sense that this character breeds and lives this ER, but he has PTSD because of this ER. He has a very much destructive relationship with the environment, and he's the captain of this ship. Everybody looks up to him, and he literally carries like this guilt of like, if I'm not here, how can this place even survive without me? And so I'm stuck here.
Let's talk about this character all the way through to the end of the show, and then we can also discuss some other characters as well. So, Robby begins the very, very moments of season two, the very first moments before the credits even finished rolling. We see he's driving to work on a motorcycle and he's not wearing a helmet. And that's kind of one of the lead images to the show as a whole. As we go throughout the season, there is this sense that he is depressed, that he might be even suicidal. And there have been a number of characters who've noticed, who are aware of Robbie's change in mood, change in affect, maybe even change in philosophy around the Pittsburgh hospital as a whole. And there are people who will directly call him out. Nurse Dana, played by Catherine Lanassa, who is, I think, maybe one of the other major actors on the show. I would say largely this is a cast of unknowns. There's Patrick Ball, who I don't believe has really ever booked a major gig. In fact, he plays Dr. Langdon, who is another one of the more tenured people at the hospital. And Langdon is a know-it-all, and we find out he's a drug addict. By the second season, he's become a little bit more humble. But Ball, as an actor, I don't know if you know this, but he was able to pay off his student loans because of the Pitt.
That's amazing.
This actor was a struggling actor in LA and was able to book this role, and it's basically changed his life. There are other actors too, Sean Hattasey. There are plenty of other actors in the Hattasey camp. He plays Dr. Abbott, who's the night shift attending. He is more of an adrenaline junkie. He's very different from Robby. He's a little more upbeat, especially in season two, and fairly balanced as ED attendings go. But Hattasey, he had a major role in Ready or Not 2. That's the first time I've really seen him. There are a couple of other smaller actors that I've seen play major roles in other shows, but not major shows. These are all TV actors at best. And because of that, this show does feel like everyone's basically on equal footing. And there's a lot of characters, and not all of them get equal screen time. But I think that the way that the show treats them, at least in season one onto season two, for the most part, it feels like until the characters maybe will disappear. In the case of like a Dr. Collins from season one, she just like kind of went away, which I think is interesting, and we could talk about it a little bit deeper in a second. But that said, this show is a different tone from industry, and at the same time is also not particularly precious about its cast. It operates with a lot of reckless abandon in terms of who it's featuring at any given point. Dr. McKay was the B plot leading lady from season 1 and really shares that role with Dana in season 2. That's Fiona Dourif's character, Dr. McKay. She is the dark-haired character, and Dana is the blonde, if you need to kind of imagine those two people, because there's a lot of names. That said, and I've had to do these notes, that's
Yeah,
why I'm
yeah,
telling
yeah.
the audience. So, that said, these characters, I think, are still, as in industry, going to be intersecting and weaving through time. You know, as I mentioned in industry, we didn't get too much of Harper in season 3 of Industry, and that was fine, I think. But that being said, it is important to note that when a character is being sidelined, it's entirely possible that they might just disappear, which I think is something that kind of scares me about this show, is that it doesn't seem to have much interest in following these characters home, in kind of forming a really rock solid character arc for every single one of these characters the way that Dr. Robby has. And you saw more of that with Dourif's character, Dr. McKay, in season 1. But in season 2, she is much more soft spoken often. She gets, you know, a little bit of edginess, but that's mostly reserved for Dana, to be honest. And yes, that has to do with the day that they're on. Dana's more on edge. McKay is much more quiet, despite the fact that they kind of had reversed roles in season 1. But at the same time, all of these characters, I think, have an importance to the show. And when you do spend a lot of time with a character like Dr. Langdon, who Dr. Langdon, as I mentioned, was a drug addict and he was stealing from the ER in season 1, by season 2, most of his character is about making peace with others and whether or not that's going to be successful. And so you do get a lot of scenes that feel a little samey. And I'm curious how you feel about that. Do you feel like maybe that affected your experience? The way that sometimes this show will not necessarily repeat plot beats, but will follow plot beats in a way that's a very slow escalation.
Well, I guess so, because at the end of the day, it does represent an hour, right? In the day. So you get the sense that,
Yeah, but look at 24. At the end of the day, it's gotta be a TV show.
yeah,
Before it is, like, actually representative of a day in the life.
yeah, but 24 is a good example and a bad example because 24 is heavily exaggerated in the sense that it is, a thriller. It is a spy thriller, to say the least. And with this is like supposed to be hyper realism. So the characters would nag each other every hour about the same issue over and over and over again because the issue doesn't go away. They're stuck together in that day. It's not like much time has actually passed. So, in a sense, I get it. I do. And again, I just keep going back to this thing. It was more enjoyable watching that first season and binging it because it didn't bother me so much. It felt part of the drama that I was like, okay, they're still nagging each other. They're still nagging each other about the same thing. But I will concede that in season 2 there was more of that nagging because there was a lot more baggage to carry on than in season 1. We were just introduced to them in season 1, and I don't know, I just feel like my issue with season 2, even though it is better reviewed than season 1, is that it just felt like it went bigger and it went bolder, but it didn't recapture it for me. It really didn't recapture sort of like that magic I felt with that first season because it felt like it was trying to do so much all at once, and some things were really successful and other things were not.
Well, so then let's talk about the other new added figure since we're comparing seasons 1 and seasons 2. Now, just to be transparent about my personal experience behind the scenes, I've been watching this show pretty much back to back, and I watch it very similarly to how I was watching season 1. I can't watch The Pit while I'm having breakfast or dinner, which is how I will often watch a lot of TV is I'll watch it before or after my workday because I still work a 9 to 5 job. So that said, there is a lot of my day that is watching TV and there's some kind of food involved. And with The Pit, I have to watch it in concentrated sections because, as you're probably aware, all of you, including the audience, this is not a show that whets the appetite.
What?
And I actually had, uh-huh. I actually had to stop. So I was trying really hard to fit this show into my already existing schedule. And I don't have a lot of free time in general. That said, I had to stop watching and had to reserve time out of my day to watch The Pit because it got to midway through season 1 there was a live birthing scene, and that was, I think, the end point for me, where I could not watch a live birth on TV with a salad in my hand. So, when you have a show like this that is pretty gritty, I don't like to binge it because I'm not much of a binger in general, and so I'll watch a few episodes at a time, but I'm gonna take a pause, and so I was pausing and pausing and pausing, and luckily, it just so happened that season 2 started to come out. So I had new episodes that I could run along with. And by the finale of season 2, I was caught up. That said, watching 1 or 2 episodes at a time, you do get a pretty keen sense of how the show is flowing into each other without feeling that rush the way that you do when you're watching 4 or 5 or 6 episodes even at a time. When you're doing that, you do feel this sense of momentum. And it's easy for the momentum to be lost when you're watching 1 episode at a time. I felt that watching the last season of Breaking Bad, actually. So I feel you where you're coming from there, where when you watch a show in rapid succession, it is easy to feel like it all kind of melds together into this beautiful, divine
I
conglomeration.
feel like you just like name dropped Breaking Bad to make a segue.
Actually, what I want to do is move totally into a different direction. And I want to talk about Al Hashimi, who is the other major character in the show that we haven't talked about yet in the seniority bracket. Because then there's also the bracket that involves as you mentioned, the people who were trainees maybe in the first season who have either moved on to, bigger and better things by the end of season 2, or have really committed themselves into the pit, or who are still trying to kind of figure it out. And these characters are important too, but Al Hashimi is a new version of the show that we haven't really seen yet. And I thought she was really cool. I thought that she added a lot, especially in the way that it's very much more character focused, and the way that she and Dr. Robby have that interplay does mirror in many ways the way that industry has that rat-a-tat between its lead character and its deuteragonist, or the antagonist being Yasmin. And in this show, you do have that deuteragonist antagonist character in Al Hashimi relative to Dr. Robby as the lead. But by, of course, the end of the season, that's kind of flipped, and now Dr. Robby is kind of the villain of the show, criticizing Al Hashimi for taking what he considers to be a huge medical
Well,
risk.
in his defense, he's right. He's 100% right.
Do you think he's right? Well, let's talk about Al Hashimi. What do you think about that character as a whole, played by Sapita Muwafi? And do you think that someone with epilepsy should be allowed to practice medicine?
I think you're trying to mean Dr. Baran al-Hashimi, sir. Sorry, we've for the audience, we've been trying to get all these names right for a good 10 minutes. And this was our best attempt.
Baran. Baran, my darling. No,
Baran.
she has such a dear as an
Yeah,
actress too.
yeah,
Love
absolutely.
you, Sapita. Okay, talk to me. What are you
Okay,
feeling?
so here's the thing. I really enjoyed her character, and especially in the beginning, because I also agree with you. I think she is very much Dr. Robbie's yang to his yin. And I really enjoyed the fact that they very much represented two different aspects of modern medicine as we see it today. Dr. Robbie very much focusing on like the more old school practices of medicine, whereas Dr. Alashimi is very much trying to introduce a more contemporary modernization of medicine with bringing in AI, which is of course a big hot topic issue, not just in the medical world, but in every industry out there, including ours. But I continued enjoying their dynamic until sort of that end, until she sort of revealed her medical condition to him. Because I understood what the show was trying to do when he flips out on her, spoiler. But at the same time, I actually completely agreed with him, and I wasn't the only one. In fact, a lot of reviewers actually were also on the side of Dr. Robbie, just because it didn't make sense in a show that is hyper realistic. It didn't make sense that a character with a medical condition such as that, where she very much has to, in her job, lead other characters and sort of take charge in the most like stressful and high intensity environment there is, to have this medical condition that she didn't disclose to anyone. It feels like medical malpractice because it is, and he even calls it out as such. And of course, we're supposed to be empathetic towards her, but at the same time, we've seen throughout the entire season how she did sort of pause throughout various moments throughout the day And luckily, she didn't pause in moments that really required her attention. But again, that was luck.
It's likely that in time, if this keeps happening, those quick reaction times will be deteriorated and she will have issues long term. And that is a question. I do think that there is a split too, though. I do believe that there are people, and I'm still on the fence, honestly, because it seems like she has broadly had success in the past. She has had a vaunted career where she has not had many of these things pop up. Now, there are certain areas of industry, I mean, particularly if you're in, say, the military, where if you have had any history of anything relating to something like that, that you're cut down totally. You are 100% not going to ever fly a plane if you have these kinds of issues. However, it seems like maybe in the medical industry, the fact of the matter is there is some leeway. Now, I don't claim to be a medical expert. I don't know anyone who is a medical expert who I think could speak on this reliably. So I'm going to give the show its credit just because obviously you're allowed to stretch credulity just a little bit in these scenarios. That said, it does highlight a pretty interesting point. The only problem is it's a point that was revealed in the last few minutes of the show, so you don't really get an opportunity to actually wrangle with this maybe even in the middle of something that would give it a lot more tension. It seems like they bring this in to a part of the show in which this absolutely has no impact on what's going to happen afterwards. Imagine if this had come in episode 6. You have a totally different time frame. And then when you do get something major happening like the ice raid that happens in mid-season 2, which was a huge political thing that happens in the show of the Pit, a show that often will highlight political topics, that would, I think, hit so much harder if a lot of the stuff that maybe the writers were just stating on throughout the writing of the Pit, if they just front loaded more of that into the middle of the show, then maybe you'd have something that did give us that same rush that we had in season 1 that I do think was just really missed in season 2. The next question then comes to Robby. So obviously, Al Hashimi is dutifully doing her best, but perhaps not so dutifully, not disclosing certain medical conditions. Robby is in a similar position where he is suffering with PTSD. I think he's also the pot calling the kettle black in those final episodes and in that one final episode in those final scenes because he is also struggling and he's also having trouble doing his job to the best of his ability. And a lot of the question throughout the last few episodes of the show is whether Robby is even going to return back from his so-called vacation or armistice or whatever they were calling it on the show.
His sabbatical.
Sabbatical. That's the word I was looking for. His sabbatical. So that is something that is a lingering question. It also asks whether the show is willing to go in a direction that many have considered a little bit tonally different from the show thus far, which is what if Robby gets injured on his motorcycle and that's part of season 3? What if Robby, heaven forbid, what if he dies? What if he doesn't make it? What if he is lost in the web of the show? What does that give the show? So I guess my first question is, Niv, do you think that they're so bold as to kill Robby and replace him? Do you think they're bold enough to have him undergo an injury? And what do we think that might look like from the concept of the show thus far?
I don't know. I don't think any of that will happen, to be honest, just because of where the final episode and that final moment sort of leaves him. It kind of reminded me of Sorry Baby in a way, maybe because there was a baby involved. But it also had to do with like a character who's deeply, suffering from PTSD, coming to terms with a child in front of them by holding that child, holding that fresh life in their hands, and sort of like seeing almost like a reflection of themselves, of something far more innocent buried deep inside of them. And I thought that was really powerful. Again, Sorry Baby did it earlier. It's like that's the image I think of, but it's very effective. I think season 3, when it comes out, will have more to do with exploring Dr. Robby's like healing journey rather than an actual consequence happening to him. I think most of those consequences will be emotional and personal rather than physical.
What do we feel about the way that the show treats politics writ large? One of the most impactful patient moments that I had this season was talking about the holes in the medical system. So the patient in mind was Diaz, And this happens a lot throughout the run of the show. Diaz, played by William Garola, who he refuses essential medical care. You may remember this. There are a
Mm-hmm.
lot of patients throughout this particular season, and it's not always easy to remember every single one. I think the other major one was the other major plot moment for Nurse Dana, where she talks a woman through an
Yep.
abortion, which is, again, very politically minded, very much something in our zeitgeist right now, and similarly, something that has a little bit of edge to it because it's a hot topic. Now, the holes in the medical system is something that I think more people can relate to, and I think it also is something they spend a little bit more time on. He refuses medical care at first, he goes back to work, and then he ends up back in the ER because of an injury that was compounded on the thing that he initially went to the ER for, which had to do with his diabetes and not taking his medication properly. So, despite Joy, who is one of the underling characters, one of the downstairs folks, she comes up with an outside the box solution to reduce his care by half, and he still leaves the ER. And so that brings in a bigger question about the show at large. It is, I think, largely more liberal in its mind, but I would say that it largely is a good balance of liberality versus other things. Now, do you feel like the show is at any time on the nose? Do you feel like we are remaining pretty rock solid in this season relative to the past? How do you feel about the way that the ice raid was portrayed?
I mean, it's interesting because I feel like everything lately has been a comment on this administration. And I think, it's just like we're responding to culture. I think like right wing people and even liberal people would say like, this is too political now, or this is too much. But I think what these shows are doing is just doing what all shows have done since the beginning of our time, which is just respond to things, respond to the culture, to the world around us in various ways. And this is just a reality. If we're talking about a hyper realistic show that focuses on an ER in Pittsburgh, you better talk about the things that, can happen in various scenarios throughout the day, including ice raids. When you think about the type of workers that work in the US medical system, most of them are immigrants, Filipinos, Arabs, etc., etc. And they're the ones that are targeted, but they're also the ones that actually were the biggest people who really protected the American population during COVID. So it's kind of like sickening seeing the irony of that they're getting punished for being immigrants, but without them, the country of the United States would have likely suffered a lot more than it did during the most horrendous pandemic we've seen in not just our generations, but many generations.
Right, the past 100 years, certainly.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, I guess I'm saying this too because I'm watching The Boys, and The Boys is very much priming itself on the fact that it is a commentary, a parody, although they would argue like a sickening reality of the current administration and their actions. At the end of the day, I stand by this. When you create a show that's true to life, you have to make it true to life, including the very ugly parts of life.
As we're rounding the end of this episode, I do want to briefly give a shout out to some of the younger folks on the show and also discuss maybe the way in which the sliding door of this show, as I've mentioned earlier in this episode, may have pros and cons. So I'll focus on just a couple of these people. There's Whitaker, who he gets a really great moment with Dr. Robby in the second half of season 1, where he picks Dr. Robby up from almost near disaster, almost near crash out. And there is a really great moment that propels him in the second season, where the actor Garen Howell, who is British, he does a great American accent. He gets to be similarly awkward, but he has a level of bravery that this situation often necessitates, but it can be so often difficult. And most of the younger characters struggle with that in some way, shape, or form. There's Mel King, played by the absolutely incredible Taylor Dearden, who throughout this season is struggling with, I would say, the most personal of all of the character journeys where she is dealing with whether she feels kind of alone in the world. She is dealing with maybe some personal mental stuff herself. She has a sister who struggled with autism and may have some underlying social anxiety and maybe even some other things springing from herself. And so she has a moment where she kind of hits an overwhelm threshold that you will often see with people who are on the autism spectrum. And that alongside the fact that she is also dealing with a deposition against a woman from season one who had refused a spinal tap to her sick child because of her belief system, which is being anti vax. Again, another thing that draws direct correlatory to the zeitgeist of the real world. That alongside Santos, who is played by Issa Briones. She is side character, I would think, mostly to Whitaker in this season. She has a lot more to do in season one, but she's also a lot more ornery in season one. And in season two, she is a bridge, I would think, towards other characters. Characters like Dr. Garcia, played by Alexandra Metz, and other characters who may have more prominence in season two, or maybe will just go away entirely. I also want to shout out Javadi, played by Shabana Aziz. She's more of a funny character. There's a couple of those where there's the silly and enigmatic parts of the show, the things that are maybe a little extreme. Whitaker got a lot of that in season one. Javadi is mostly tasked with the more silly one-off patients in season two. Occasionally, she gets moments of real pathos, maybe some real terror in her arc, but it is mostly aligned with things like the fact that she's a TikTok star and also a doctor. So things like that. So you do get a little bit more breadth with this cast of characters, but what you also do get is occasionally there are characters who get sidelined. So the character of Mohan, who is, I think, one of my favorites, played by Supriya Ganesh, she has been an ensemble cast member throughout season one. And actually, something similar happened to Dr. Collins, Tracy Ejiofor, in season one, where Collins left the show after season one. Mohan is going to be leaving after season two. In turn, an existing cast member, Dr. Ellis, played by Aisha Harris, who is largely alongside a lot of these younger characters in the past two seasons. She's been a co star in a few episodes, but she's a guest appearance, not a regular appearance. She's getting promoted to lead, which is amazing. That being said, I do think it is important to note that within the past two seasons of this show, we are seeing two people of color who have been cut from the show without a whole lot of fanfare. And I think that this is just an important thing to put a pin on. I'm not saying that it's necessarily racist or bad or evil or wrong of the show, but it does put up a flag. Maybe not a red flag, but a yellow flag for me, that this could be a potential issue with the show if it ran for 10 seasons, which it may, in the way in which it treats its cast of characters and whether it's a popularity contest.
There's been a lot of drama about this, and it very much like has found its way towards everybody commenting about it too. And I think for me, what's interesting is sort of the commentary that the showrunners have had about it, right? Which is the ER is a teaching hospital, like that specific ER is a teaching hospital and it's set up as such. And so their sort of response is that the show is built in a way that it's supposed to have a rotating cast. And that in itself is true. We've seen cast rotate, we've seen new characters come in, we've seen less focus on other characters. I mean, Javadi's love interest was far more, focused on in the first season. In the second season, he was there, but barely, present until like the latter half of season two. And I think that, the commentary about it is very much valid in the sense of like, look, we need to protect people of color and how they're represented. And also, more importantly, make sure that they are showcased equally with everybody else. But at the same time, it becomes icky because the character that is getting much more focused on in season three, who's been bumped up from reoccurring to main, is also a person of color, but a different sort of color, So it becomes like this thing where you're just kind of like, okay, there is nothing clean about this because nothing is quote unquote clean. This is, at the end of the day, a show trying to very much stay true to, again, that hyper realism, which is These characters come in and out, just like other human beings do. And it makes a lot of sense when it's like a show that focuses on one day in one year, and each season represents like another year that has passed. It's just kind of like, what can I say about this? And I think that that's what got the showrunners in trouble, because they themselves had this position of like, okay, what can we say about this? There is no clean answer here.
Right. You just have to lean back on what the engine of the show is and say that, like, we are going to stand by our position as writers. But at the end of the day, you have to kind of wonder, where is this going to go in the future? I mean, that is worth noting because about 2 years ago, there was a show on HBO called The Idol. And now we're seeing the repercussions of how that creator's interest in things like sexuality is playing into a new and sometimes divisive show, Euphoria, which is going to be our next episode on the podcast Zeitgeist, which will be coming around the corner about next month. Until then, we are going to be watching that show, and we are also going to be covering the A24 movie The Drama, which I don't believe will be on HBO Max when that premieres. So feel free to watch it in theaters at this time if you still can. Or I believe it will now be on video on demand. So feel free to watch it there if you'd like. And go ahead and tune in. Hopefully you've seen The Drama already. I think it's a great movie. Highly recommend. We get to talk all about Zendaya and her star power. Until then, I mean, we are also going to be getting another episode of The Pitt next year. So all of these open questions that we currently have about this show and about Warner Max or Paramount Max or Warner Plus, all of this is going to just kind of keep unfolding as time moves on. So, it's not the best time to be an American citizen or a European citizen or really a citizen of the world. But, by and large, we're getting through, and our media is definitely supporting that in many ways. But that being said, I'm glad that we're able to stay critical here on Zeitgeist. Until next time, thanks so much to the Powerknobs and for my co-producer, Jolyn Reyes McKinley. If you enjoy this episode, please give us a rating on your podcast player of choice. We are on Instagram at Zeitgeist Pulp. I have been your co-host, Jordan Conrad.
And I have been Hugo Buzz.
And our next episode will be on June 28th, where we'll be covering The Drama and Euphoria. Until then, stay critical, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.